I'm Sam Rosenfarb. Welcome to the White Collar Crime Report. This is a special show dedicated to the career of a man who's touched so many of our lives. Former U.S. Attorney and former U.S. District Court Judge, currently with Stern and Greenberg of Roseland, New Jersey, a great American, the Honorable Judge Herbert Stern. Welcome, Judge Stern. It's an honor to have you as my guest.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Sam.
Thank you. You're known as the architect of white-collar crime prosecution. How did you gain that distinction?
Well, I don't know about this architect stuff, but I remember that in 1969 when Fred Lacey and I went into the U.S. Attorney's office, we felt that New Jersey was in a lot of trouble. You know, you had terribly corrupt administrations in Atlantic City and Jersey City and Newark. And we had the opportunity, the privilege and the pleasure of going after them. And the cases began to flow and the convictions began to flow, and we had a bunch of young kids in the office, and it was just a great time.
Well, do you think it was just hard work or good luck, or the opportunity was there at the right time? What caused these prosecutions to be so successful?
Well, actually, we developed a system. For example, in Jersey City, everybody said it was a way of life. It cost 10% to do business, so we tested it out, you know. We went down, and what we did was we got all of the records out of City Hall and determined who the successful bidders were. Then we subpoenaed in all their records, all their documents, the bidders. And what we were doing, we had two principles. Number one, a public official never takes a payoff by check. And number two, a businessman doesn't walk in and cash a check for $5, $10, $15, or $20,000 and walk out with greenbacks for a legitimate purpose. So we kept turning checks. We found the checks that were drawn to cash or cashed. We brought in the people that cashed it, gave them immunity, and we just got basketfuls of public officials.
Wow, that's so interesting. You know, I noticed that Michael Chertoff, the current U.S. Attorney at the American Bar Association meeting, said that political corruption is still today his #1 target. Is it true that nothing's changed?
Well, when you say, you mean do people still take what isn't his and must give back and go to prison?
Right.
Well, sure. The nature of people hasn't changed in 20 years.
Are politicians, do you think, by nature corrupt? Is that what's causing all of the headlines that we see?
Well, you know, it would be unjust to stigmatize or characterize any group of people in that way, but I think everybody is offered temptations in every walk of life. Politicians, because they have great power, sometimes succumb to great temptations. And don't forget, the people who give them the money are not politicians, they're business people. So it's not a one-way street by any means.
Well, is it a cost of doing business? Is that what this is all about?
Well, it's what some people think it's about, and the people who think that way are committing crimes. It's too expensive to the country, you know, because all of that gets built into what the taxpayers pay ultimately for public works. It gets built into loss of revenue by the Internal Revenue Service because people don't report that sort of income.
What's the cost to society? Do you think it's a larger cost than the crimes committed violently, or how does it compare?
Oh, I have no doubt about that. You know, I have no doubt about that, and I know it isn't fashionable particularly. Every generation has a new rallying cry. I remember very well Nader's point, which I thoroughly agreed with and which we dedicated ourselves to, you know. We viewed crime in the streets. Every bit of danger as crime in the streets. Sure, what happens to people in the streets is violent and terrible, and that has to be dealt with and has to be stamped out, and people who do that have to be dealt with severely. But, you know, when people at the top of society steal and cheat, it's not just the money. It's the example that's set. I mean, how do you persuade people not to steal small amounts if around them they see people stealing large amounts?
Well, certainly with your experience in, according to this Tiger in the Court book written by Paul Hoffman about you, it says, Herbert J. Stern, the U.S. Attorney who prosecuted 8 mayors, 2 secretaries of state, 2 state treasurers, 2 powerful political bosses, 1 U.S. congressman, and 64 other public officials. That's quite a career in terms of greed, in terms of people having the opportunity to cost the taxpayers millions and millions of dollars. Would you do it again?
Would I do it again? I don't know if I, you know, I'm on to the next thing, and in my life I always kind of went forward. From there I became a federal judge and served for 13 years, and now I'm in private practice. I enjoyed all of my experiences. I began as an assistant DA in Manhattan.
Right, as an assistant DA in Manhattan, you were involved in the Malcolm X murder, weren't you?
Well, not in the sense...
No, I'm sorry, right. No, I don't mean you helped plan it in any way, but you were one of the prosecutors involved in that murder.
Actually, I was in the Homicide Bureau,
right.
and I was on duty the day that Malcolm X was shot and killed, and I caught the case. It was my case. So I wound up in arresting the three men or ordering the arrest of the three men who were convicted.
Were they New Jersey men?
One was.
One was.
One was out of Newark.
Boy, that's
you know that film that fairly recently came out about
the Malcolm X?
Yeah.
Sure.
You know, I'm no expert on his entire life, but I must tell you that that portion of the film which described the shooting and reenacting it was right on. It was actually very, very accurate according to the way it actually happened.
So your illustrious career came very early. You got the opportunity to prosecute a famous murder case.
Well, I actually didn't. I left to go to the Department of Justice before the case was tried, but I did have it through the indictment stage.
I see.
Get to try it.
Terrific. I was browsing through this book, Robert Rudolph's book, Mafia Wise Guy. It says, Herbert J. Stern launched a crackdown on crime and corruption in New Jersey that was unparalleled in the nation's history. In fact, when federal prosecutors in Maryland initiated an investigation into the finances of the then Vice President Spiro T. Agnew, they consulted with New Jersey Stern for advice on how to best build their case. Boy, that's quite an accolade. What was your involvement in the Spiro Agnew case in terms of your consultations?
Well, actually, what happened was the then U.S. Attorney in Maryland, George Bell, came up and he wanted to do an investigation, and he asked us, you know, what our techniques were, and I described to him exactly the system that I described to you and to your viewers earlier. We gave him copies of our subpoenas and our memos of law. He didn't start out looking for Agnew, but using this system of pulling out successful bidders, looking through their books and records, examining to see cash transactions. He ultimately wound up with Agnew, Agnew even taking money in the office of Vice President. And as you know, they brought an indictment against him, and he had to resign in office. And
he resigned.
Yeah.
You know, as a forensic accountant doing investigative accounting activities, your system, you've orchestrated a system that sounds perfect. It's just the kind of work program that we would use in our office.
I think your accountants could do a great job enlisting in civic enterprises like that. I really believe that in the end, people don't take, you know, large payoffs by check. And so you look for the cash. That's one of the systems, and it's been employed, I think, fairly successfully around the country.
What are one of your most interesting crimes that you've been involved in, either as a judge?
Sam, you keep saying that.
Yeah,
I'm not involved in the crimes.
I keep saying it, but I'm
no,
sorry.
It's all right. I'm only kidding around.
A case that you've been in, I want to say a participant, as a prosecutor, as a judge, as an attorney. Right now, you're in private practice. I'm sure you've had some interesting cases.
Right. You know, while you're doing any of them, they're always exciting, and you always invest yourself in them. I see you have this book on the table, so you know there was a brief moment in history when I became the United States judge for Berlin.
So most interesting facts about a judicial area that I've ever read or known about.
I think that was exciting. I think when Fred Lacey and I tried the Adnesio case, you know, when we demonstrated that Newark had fallen into the hands of the mob and public officials simultaneously, with guys like Tony Boyardo and Mayor Adnesio, I think that was an extremely exciting time. You know, we went on trial with him while he was running against Ken Gibson. He was the incumbent mayor. Gibson was challenging him. And the election was held in the midst of the trial. Those were very exciting days.
It sounds very exciting. What was he convicted of?
Extortion. 64 counts of extortion.
Wow. And in what manner did he extort money? What was his story?
Well, you know, people who wanted to do public work, that is to say get contracts, had to kick back, and we uncovered, I mean, enormous enterprises in which they used dummy bank accounts. They used a phony, I never forget, this was very interesting. They persuaded a fellow named Irving Cantor to set up, he was a plumbing supply house, he set up an entirely fictitious account. They put through, they got a $10 million city contract. That was pretty big stuff back in the mid-60s, you know.
That was when $10 million was a lot of money.
Yeah. And then they funneled $1 million into that account, took it out in cash, passed it through the Boyardo organization into the Adenisia organization, and Cantor testified for us on his deathbed. He was suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, you know, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. We had to bring the entire jury, the entire court, up to the hospital, and he could hardly speak. As a matter of fact, his wife had to serve as his interpreter.
Oh, boy.
As he croaked out his testimony, literally. He did that, by the way, just to put himself straight with the highest court of all.
Oh, wow.
He
That's
wanted
very
to help,
interesting.
Yeah, he wanted to help the country.
I'd like to hear more about the Adenisia trial. We'll hear more from Judge Stern. We just have to break for a short time. Thank you. Welcome back to the White Collar Crime Report. This is Sam Rosenfarb, and I'm talking to former U.S. District Court Judge Herbert Stern. We're discussing his prosecution of Hugh Adenisia, former mayor of Newark. Judge Stern, before we left for the break, you were describing to us what it was that Hugh Adenisia was convicted of. Let's go back to that, because that's a fascinating story.
All right. Well, as I said, it was 64, maybe I didn't say, 64 counts of extortion. George Barlow, the judge, he's gone now, but he was a tremendous judge. He gave him 10 years. Then, within 8 or 9 months, we were trying virtually the entire administration at the time of Jersey City and Hudson County, Boss Kenny, Mayor Whalen, President City Council, Flaherty. We convicted them in front of Robert Shaw. Unfortunately, he's not with us either, but he gave those fellas 15 years. I remember we found that the mayor of Jersey City and the President City Council together had a joint numbered bank account in Florida with $1,231,000 in it. Joint account. I thought that was something you only did with your wife.
Right. Boy, that's interesting. It's fascinating to me that they were so blatant about their crimes in accumulating this cash together.
Yeah, well, it was almost a tradition in those days. It stemmed back to Boss Haig. First there was Haig, and then there was Kenny, and Cornelius Gallagher, who was a congressman, was circling around. I remember putting him in the grand jury. He had a satchel with him. He wanted to see me alone first. I wouldn't see him. He had a satchel with him with, if I remember correctly, about $400,000 or $500,000 in bearer bonds.
Wow.
Yeah,
and he wanted to see you alone with the satchel.
But I had it up. So he said they were really the funds of the party. He said he just didn't know what to do with them.
Boy, that's fascinating. You said they got sent away for 10 years or 15 years. Right. Do they get sent to these, what people think of as country club prisons? Is that the kind of incarceration that these corrupt politicians face?
Well, I don't know where every one of them went. I think Adenisia went to Lewisburg, which was a very difficult place. Once I did my job, that was it. That was up to the Bureau of Prisons at that time. I can tell you this. Liberty, freedom, the most important thing in the world. If you don't have that, if you're put anywhere, it's a terrible thing.
Yeah. So these people think that these white-collar criminals get sent away to these country club prisons where they have golf courses and tennis courts. That's still the loss of liberty and incarceration and a punishment.
I can tell you, I don't know about this business about tennis courts and so forth. But I know I wouldn't want anybody telling me what time to get up, what time to go to bed, and telling me what time to eat and what to eat and where I can't go. And you know, for most people, these people that you call white-collar criminals, they're usually the top of society. For them, just an indictment is a calamity.
Just a loss of reputation.
They get brought in, they have to be photographed, fingerprinted, taken before a court.
Yeah.
Bail is set, stand trial, they get convicted, they get put away. I think it's appropriate, mind you, but make no mistake about it. The fall is further, and the impact is greater.
Your career changed from a prosecutor to a U.S. District Court judge. How was that distinction? What was the greatest part of that distinction? Now, judging and hearing both sides of the argument rather than just the prosecution side.
Well, yeah, you go from being a pitcher or a batter to an umpire.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably why I left after 13 years. You know, I wanted to get back to the pitching and the batting and stop umpiring.
In your book, the book you wrote, Judgment in Berlin, it tells a fascinating story about the formation of a U.S. court in Berlin. And I just want to read one sentence from it. It says, "A judge nearly always sentences in crossfires of purpose. He must not aim to please the mob, yet his sentence should not defeat legitimate expectations of the society in whose name it is imposed." That sounds to me that the judgment is both, has to fit the crime, has to have some element of punishment, and has to also cater to the public's expectations. Does a judge did you as a judge take that into account in sentencing?
I tried. I mean, it's a very difficult thing when one human being has to make those kinds of decisions about another one. It's an enormous power, and it's a humbling thing. You know, it's easy to be free with somebody else's time,
Right.
somebody else's life. And I meant what I wrote.
This book was made into a movie, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And you were played by Martin Sheen, right?
That is
correct?
true. That's right.
That's a very interesting story. Tell us a little bit about this story, Judgment in Berlin, because to me it was fascinating.
Right. Well, what happened basically was a couple of East Germans were fleeing the communist secret police, because at that time, you know, the world was carved up between us and them. And they diverted a Polish plane that was heading into East Berlin, Schoenfeld Airport, and they diverted it 10 miles to Tempelhof, which was in West Berlin.
This was when the wall was built in Berlin.
Wall was up, sure.
Right.
And the West Germans didn't want to prosecute him because, you know, for them, every German had a right to leave, and they had, you know, similar to the law of Israel, everybody was a citizen of West Germany. So they prevailed upon the Americans to establish an occupation court. And I became the United States judge for Berlin.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it.
Fascinating. So you were a judge sitting in New Jersey,
Yes.
asked to hold this court in Berlin.
Yes, I was flying back and forth between the two courts.
The court was physically in Berlin.
Yeah, they built a courtroom for one case.
Boy, it's fascinating. Interesting story. One of the parts of the book that touched me was your evaluation of justice, whether it be in Berlin or New Jersey, that a judge has to be independent. And you got the impression somehow that these politicians who put you there, they wanted to control your decision. How did you react to that?
Well, you know, I got more than an impression.
Right.
They began to give me instructions. The State Department began to tell me how to decide things, and of course I told them I wouldn't do it. And I did it the way I think, in the end, the American people want their judges to behave, and that is to follow your own conscience and do what you think is right. So, in the end, you know, they shut down the court.
Right. And that was the last time it was held, correct?
Goodbye.
Yeah. And you came back to continue on the bench here as district court judge.
Yes.
For another number of years. You're now in private practice.
Yes.
Now defending some of these people who were accused of crimes.
Occasionally.
Occasionally. How do you feel about that? Being first on the prosecution side, prosecuting criminals, now on the defense side, defending criminals.
No, you've got it wrong.
Oh,
When I prosecuted, They were criminals.
Right.
Now I'm defending innocent people.
Ah, I see. All of your clients are innocent people.
Well, I wouldn't take them otherwise.
Well, they're innocent, I guess, according to the under the law. Is there a different mindset in defending versus prosecuting versus being a justice?
Not really. You know, as a prosecutor, you have no interest in prosecuting innocent people. At least no decent human being would do that. Mm-hmm. In defending people, you have no interest in lying or cheating. At least no decent person would do that. In the end, you know, any attorney who isn't reasonable, who doesn't take reasonable positions, who you know, acts like a fool, is neither going to be an effective advocate or a good lawyer or do very much for his or her client, whether the client's a public body or an individual.
Boy, that's a terrific perspective. It
It's the
says
truth.
you do your job to the best of your ability with high integrity.
That's what it's all about.
That's terrific. There's an impression that white-collar criminals, criminals who aren't accused of violent crimes, get lighter sentences than rapists, murderers, people who steal, people who commit violent crimes. Vis-a-vis the harm of society, before we talked about these political corruption trials causing immense cost to society. Do you think the sentences are lighter? Are they lighter today than they were when you were a judge?
I think, you know, it gets idiosyncratic in the sense that it depends who the judge is. Of course, that's changed a lot now in the federal system. There has been a big change even since I left the federal bench. Today, the discretion of a judge in federal court is very narrow in criminal sentencing. They have what's called the guidelines, Sam, and they got a grid, and you get so many points for the amount of the theft, and so many points if you have a record, and so many points if you've helped the government, and so many points if you haven't, and so many points if you've fessed up.
So there's not much discretion then on the part of the
Very
judge?
little today. I would say the discretion now is 6 to 9 months within the guidelines.
I see. That's different than when you were a judge.
Oh, when I was a judge, if someone was convicted of extortion, they could get anything from nothing to 20 years. But there's this difference too. When we sentenced in the old days, the mandatory amount that the person had to do was 1/3, and you maxed out after 2/3. Today,
That's before parole, 1/3 before parole, and
no, you couldn't get parole usually until you'd done 1/3.
I see.
Today, under the guidelines, the sentences look smaller, but most people do almost all the time. So the sentences are, in fact,
There's no more probation after 1/3. No more parole after 1/3.
no more.
Oh, that's a
It's
huge
all over.
difference.
Oh, yeah.
Are the wealthy treated differently in court by the system?
Well, you know, I suppose very wealthy people can afford better lawyers, but you know, very wealthy people can afford better accountants.
That's true.
Right, Sam?
That's
better doctors. You know, we have to work to make sure that everybody gets at least adequate help. I don't know how you eliminate the fact that people who have more money buy bigger cars, but we have to make sure as a society that at least everybody gets adequate legal help.
And does the difference in lawyers make that much of a difference in a criminal trial, a white-collar crime trial? When you were a judge, did you see major distinctions in the quality, the competence of the defense attorneys versus the quality, competence in the prosecution? And did that make much difference?
Well, I think rather than that analogy, I saw varying degrees of talent among prosecutors, varying degrees of talent among defense attorneys. You better believe it makes a difference.
It does make a difference.
Well, sure.
So, well, if it does...
Tell me, would a better painter make a better painting?
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
no question about it. Well, so justice is not necessarily blind. Sometimes it has a price.
We don't live within this, I mean, we don't live within a self-executing system. Better doctors give you a better chance of surviving. Better lawyers give you a better chance of victory.
That's a very interesting analogy. Why do you think New Jersey still has such a terrible reputation?
I don't think it has a bad reputation. I'm proud to be from New Jersey.
Well,
Sam, I can't agree with... Look,
we see stand-up comedians make jokes about New Jersey as the political corruption capital of the world.
Oh, it's nonsense. I mean, you look at places like Chicago, Dade County, I mean, historically speaking. We just heard about Baltimore County in Maryland. That gave us Spiro Agnew. Large urbanized areas, densely populated, festooned with rules and regulations designed to make people get permits and certificates and permissions. These are breeding grounds.
Well, that's an excellent explanation. I've never heard that explanation about why New Jersey has that reputation. It makes sense to me.
You know, anywhere where you have to get a lot of government approvals before you can move are breeding grounds for shortcuts and pressure points. Shortcuts taken by businessmen and pressure points public officials.
We just have a minute and a half. What's your message to today's citizen?
I'm no longer a messenger. You know, I spent 25 years in the public service, and now I'm in private practice. I have no platform to run on. I think we all have to work together as human beings to make society as good as we can, not just for us, but for our children and for our grandchildren, and that's irrespective of whether we're lawyers or accountants or bus drivers or what we do.
That's
not much of a message, but it's all I have.
No, that's excellent. Judge Stern, thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. For the White Collar Crime Report, this is Sam Rosenfarb. See you next time. Thank you. Hello, I'm Sam Rosenfarb. Welcome to the White Collar Crime Report. Our topic tonight is how to commit fraud and get away with it. To discuss this topic, I have Alfred Ferguson, senior litigator from McCarter & English, the largest law firm in New Jersey, and Edmund Pankow, chairman of Intertech Inc., an international financial investigative agency located in Houston, Texas. Alfred, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Sam, I've been a lawyer for about 30 years. And as you well know, lawyers deal in fraud every day. We advise people who have committed fraud. We advise people who have fraud committed against them. So after 30 years, it's almost become second nature to look for it.
Fraud seems to be a hot topic today. Ed, tell us a little bit about your firm.
Well, I started this business 20 years ago as a one-man agency after leaving the government as a federal agent. And it was the first business private investigation agency in the country. And because of the need for white-collar crime investigation, it grew from 1 to 2 to 5 to 10 to 20 to 50 people. And today we do work all over the world.
Terrific. What's one of your most fascinating cases?
Probably has to be the Manuel Noriega case. We did a lot of asset searching and located millions of dollars worth of property and assets all over the world.
How'd you accomplish that?
Well, we had a little bit of luck, and we bagged Manuel Noriega's computers during the invasion. And our investigators came into possession of his actual computer disks and printouts that showed where these properties and assets were.
Oh, so you did it by high tech. I read your book. Check it out. Terrific book telling you how to find assets, how to locate hidden dollars. I just want to read a short excerpt. It says, I just happened to be in Panama during the 1989 invasion sitting in a bar when parachutes blossomed all over. Is that how did you get to Panama?
Well,
So I just happened to be in Panama.
I was in Panama on another investigation. I was investigating one of the savings and loan cases for the government, and I was working for regulators trying to find money that an insurance company fraud had deposited in Panama with Manuel Noriega. They wanted to set up a phony reinsurance company in Panama, and I was tracing that money when the invasion actually took place.
Very interesting.
Very,
Al, do you get involved in any insurance frauds? Any other? What is your most interesting case?
Oh, I don't know if I have one most interesting like the General Noriega case, but
That's a fascinating case.
we have lots of littler cases where you find assets, you try and find assets. One of the real problems for lawyers, and as you know for CPAs too, is the responsibilities that a lawyer has when you uncover fraud. And a great deal of attention is being paid to that now by the organized bar, because it's difficult when you're representing somebody who comes in and says, I've committed a fraud, what do I do, how do you help me? You have to be very, very careful about what you can disclose, who to, how you get involved with the authorities, and what you can do. It's a very, very dicey situation.
You know, as a forensic accountant, I've been involved in a number of divorces where husbands or wives, today more so than in the past, have squirreled away assets or hidden assets. And our job is to find out what is the company really worth, or how much money does he really earn. I find a lot of newly divorced, newly separated people who own businesses suffer from the disease of RAIDs, R-A-I-D-S, recently acquired income deficiency. Do you find that? Do you find they start hiding assets?
I'd say 50% of the family law work we do, you have assets either hidden away or undervalued or income streams diverted someplace else.
And as an investigator, how do you find that?
Well, there's a number of ways, and most of it's through the paper trail. One of the best ways is to get the oldest financial statement they prepared, one they made back 10 years ago when they needed to borrow money, and compare it to the new financial statement they've made today. And you look what was on the old one and what's not on the new one, and trace it to see where it's gone.
You have an accounting degree, so you have the wherewithal to do that. Is that required for all the people who work in your agency?
No, the accounting degree helps because you can't investigate white-collar crime or do business investigation unless you understand business. I found it's much easier to take an auditor or an accountant and make them an investigator than to take an investigator and make them an accountant.
Right.
But
that sounds right to me, too.
Yeah. Well, in this business, there's certain tricks, like 9 out of 10 people that hide money hide it in their spouse's maiden name. So being in the business and doing this every day, we have red flags, we have procedures that we look for because various people commit them time after time after time.
Do you think the downturn in the economy is causing an increase in white-collar crime?
I tend to think not, simply because the people who do the most white-collar crime are the least affected by a downturn in the economy. On the theory that the economic downturn affects the lower income levels of society, and the people who are doing the white-collar crime are generally in the upper income levels.
Ed, you've been involved in so many fascinating cases. Tell us a little bit about the case that I read, individual hiding dollar bills in his scuba diving gear.
Well, we had a case once where we were investigating an accountant, and this accountant...
Now, accountants don't commit crimes.
Never. Well, this accountant, the first weekend of every month, went to the Cayman Islands. And when he went there, he always brought his scuba tanks. Now, number one, the pattern of going there every time was something that you'd wonder about, because divers don't go to the same place every time. They always want to see some new rocks and some new fish. Other than that, a real diver never takes his own scuba tanks because they could explode, they're heavy, you rent them. So after this person had done this 7 or 8 times, we found that there was a pattern there, and we had the U.S. Customs people open those tanks. And inside we found 13 envelopes of money. One said Dr. Smith, one said Dennis this, lawyer Bob.
It's a hell of an underwater cachet he had there.
Well, he'd opened a number of accounts for people down there, and we made him an offer he couldn't refuse, that he could become a witness or a co-defendant.
Well, I guess he chose the right choice, I guess.
That did work out that way.
People have the impression that white-collar crime and criminals aren't prosecuted to the extent of violent crimes and criminals. What's your opinion about that, Al?
When the prosecutors get a hold of them, they do, absolutely. And indeed, I think there's been a much increased emphasis on prosecution of white-collar fraud and crime. Certainly in New Jersey today, with the recent investigations about the bus stings, for instance, where the prosecutors set up a phony bus accident. They had 9 investigators sitting in the bus as passengers. They faked an accident,
right.
and then all of a sudden 14 people showed up from the streets, got in the bus and filed claims on the accident.
More insurance fraud. People are just falling all over themselves to get in on the act.
But there's a reason why. I mean, New Jersey has a very strong insurance fraud section now in the Attorney General's office, and there's a reason for that, and that is that everybody is paying attention to the insurance premiums we pay for our auto insurance, as well as health and the other kinds of insurance. And unfortunately, New Jersey has a reputation for having a large segment of its population ready to commit fraud at the drop of a hat.
Do you think that's endemic to New Jersey?
Well, it's not really endemic to New Jersey. What I see and what I'm afraid of is what happened in our banks and savings and loans is going to happen even worse in the insurance industry. That we're going to have insurance company failures because of these claims and because of the growing issues of fraud, and we're going to lose more money in this country through insurance fraud and through insurance company failures than we ever did in our banks.
I know that people think nothing of ripping off their insurance companies. If they have the trunk of their car broken into, all of a sudden they claim they've had VCRs, cameras, stereo equipment in their trunks because they figure the insurance companies are going to pay for it. The cost to society, though, for this white-collar crime is huge, isn't it?
Absolutely huge.
Yeah. Is it, in comparison, do you think there's a greater harm to society from white-collar crime as compared to violent crime? You know, we live in a violent world.
Well,
Sam, that's a tough question to answer. You're talking about your physical safety when you go out on the street versus the safety of your bank account.
Yeah.
Now, you can answer that question better than I can.
Well, as a CPA, I hold my bank account very dearly,
But
but I also hold my life dearly as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What is your life worth? But the damage to the American public is far greater from white-collar crime because that's the reason that many people are out of a job. That's the reason that many of our programs aren't working, because fraud costs as much as 10 cents of every dollar in many areas. So someone with a gun and a knife may do a robbery for $500, but someone with a pen and a computer may get 500 million.
Well, I read something you wrote about how the bank teller who steals $5,000 may get 2 or 3 years in jail if she steals it from a bank she's employed with, whereas the bank president who steals $5 million, he may get much less than that. Do you think that the wealthier the criminal, the more the difference in representation makes in his incarceration or in his conviction? Do you think that having that additional dollars, being able to employ or engage a higher priced attorney makes a difference?
Absolutely.
It does.
Sure.
How do we change that? How do we change that system, or should we change it?
Well, through asset forfeiture programs, which the government now has, in many cases they can seize the fruits of the crime, the money, up front. If that happens, then they can't use that money for defense, as they often did in the past.
I see. They've been using the funds that they accumulated wrongfully.
On the other hand, let me tell you about the Newport cases here in New Jersey and New York, where the federal government, the SEC, came in and used the RICO, the asset forfeiture, to seize, in effect, an entire brokerage firm. They then had the trial, and of course the defendants were acquitted by the jury, found not guilty. But the damage had been done, and the government had already seized and put the brokerage firm out of business.
I mean, they seized the assets before there was a conviction?
Yes, under the new law they can do that.
At the same time as the indictment, they seized the assets.
All assets that they could find?
And indeed, the Justice Department in San Francisco just moved and seized a law firm of a highly well-known lawyer who did a lot of white-collar criminal defense work, and it was alleged that he had furthered a drug conspiracy, so they seized his law firm.
But it sounds un-American to me. You're guilty before proven guilty.
Many people agree with you, Sam, and a lot of criminal defense lawyers are very, very upset.
Well, I'd like to talk more about that after we get back from this break. We're just going to have a short break. We'll be back with White Collar Crime Report, Alfred Ferguson from McCarter and English, Edmund Pankow from Intertech Agency, Houston, Texas. Welcome back. This is Sam Rosenthal for White Collar Crime Report. I have with me Alfred Ferguson, senior litigator for McCarter & English, largest law firm in New Jersey, and Ed Pankow, investigator for Intertech Agency in Houston, Texas. Gentlemen, before the break, we were talking about the seizure law, which to me sounds fascinating, where the government merely on an indictment can take assets from a defendant who hasn't been convicted. Tell me a little bit about that. I'm fascinated by it.
It's called RICO, which is Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations. And if you make the proper allegations, the government has the right to come in and seize the assets or the fruits of the crime. And the defendant, the accused, can't use them, either to pay legal fees or do anything else with them.
But what happened to innocent until proven guilty?
A thing of the past, at least in RICO investigations. Because the damage, technically you're not guilty, but your assets and your business is liable to be shut down. Indeed, the threat of that is a formidable weapon, and the government can obtain quick settlements and quick pleas by using the RICO indictment and threatening seizure as a total obliterating attack before the event.
Is this threat because of the tremendous increase in white-collar crime and corruption? What do you think, Ed?
Well, the real reason for it is that in so many cases, by the time they got a conviction, the money was moved offshore in the Isle of Man and Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, and the government...
But then we can employ guys like you to go and find it. That's what you do for a living, right?
It's then moved into 50 different places, and often it's spent, that the people will go on a drunken orgy of spending because they know they're going to go to jail.
I see. So the government seizes it up front.
Exactly.
Do they get convictions in a lot of cases?
Well, Sam, look, let's take another look at this. The government threatened to file a RICO indictment against a law firm in New York. Now, the assets of the law firm weren't going anyplace. The assets of a law firm are all the lawyers working,
right,
and work in progress. So it was a naked power play to threaten the firm to plead guilty and pay a fine, or else they'd shut him down.
Boy, what a Damocles sword, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
That's what it is. It's one of the government's most potent tools, but it's particularly effective in drug cases and in cases where great amounts of money have been taken as the fruits of a crime.
Talking about great amounts of money, this Michael Milken case, there are very few people who really understand what he did wrong, how he manipulated the junk bond market, but they know it had to do with a lot of money. Any opinions on that case? Michael Milken and his millions?
Michael Milken doesn't think he did anything wrong, flat out, and there are many, many who agree that he did not do anything wrong.
What was he accused of?
Well, he was accused of manipulating the bond market.
And he was convicted. He not only was accused, he was convicted.
He was convicted of that and of making something like $600 million through this manipulation and conspiracy with others, that they planned to create this whole junk market bank failure, that they knew up front that what they were doing was not a viable business deal.
And what's the harm to society?
Oh, well, wait a minute, I got to disagree with that. In the first place, I'm not speaking for Mike Milken, and I don't represent him,
of course.
And I'm not an SEC securities lawyer, but he wasn't convicted, he pled guilty. He was not, he was never had to go to trial. And the reason that they let him plead was that they had a hard time, they had real doubts about whether they could prove their case, because he had very good lawyers, and Mike Milken was an incredible success story. Now, he did not conspire to create the bank failures and the junk bond debacle. He did
Is there an allegation that part of what he did?
Well, the indictment was, 6 inches thick, so I'm not quite sure. I don't want to take the time to detail everything at the
How about Leona Helmsley? That made tremendous headlines.
Well, Leona Helmsley was guilty of being rich, and she made a few bad statements, and somebody picked her up on it. But I just point out to you, Sam, that I think 3 consecutive nominees for Attorney General of the United States couldn't take the job because they hadn't paid their taxes.
That's true.
Now, Leona Helmsley didn't pay her taxes, but they're in a much more obvious and flagrant way. But the principle isn't all that much different, is it?
No, it doesn't seem to be. Do you have any cases that you think we might be interested in? Because I know as a litigator for McCarter & English, you must come across some fascinating stories.
You come across a lot of interesting things as you go through all those litigated matters, but we had an investment banker who was dealing in millions of dollars, and yet he took the time to take $200,000 and get it over to Switzerland, put it in an account, And then when he'd go there with his girlfriend, he'd just go in and write a check for cash and take 20 or 30,000 out and go spend it and have a good time.
That sounds like fun.
Well, it was
How did he
great
manage
fun.
to do that? How did he steal the $200,000?
Well, he didn't. He was his own money. He just took it, but he was trying to keep it away from his wife. You see.
I see. And guys like Ed Pankow, they find those kinds of money with their resources that are provided, and check it out.
Well,
tell me, how would you find this in Switzerland?
In quite a few different ways. Whatever you do, wherever you go, you leave a paper trail. When you travel, that goes into computers of the airline reporting service. When you stay in a hotel, you leave a trail from the phone numbers that you leave and the people you call. Everything you do today, if you buy traveler's checks, on the backs of them we can tell where you cash them. You literally can go nowhere and do nothing without leaving some trail, and a real good investigator today makes his living following that paper trail. What they do is try to recreate your past and see where you went from point A to point B and what you did in there.
Wow.
If you rented a car and you drove 66 miles from Bern, Switzerland, I know within a radius of 33 miles you did something and you went to some bank or did something there.
In your practice,
Disgruntled employees, Sam.
disgruntled employees.
Disgruntled
yeah.
employees. There's nobody you can go through life without offending at some point or other. And if you've done something wrong and they know about it, they're going to blow the whistle.
So there's
on
always
you.
an informant. I read somewhere
Yeah.
where 80% of white-collar crime is uncovered through informants.
Well,
Does that
Leona,
sound-
Leona Helmsley got the whistle blown on her by people who worked on her estate. And they knew what she was doing and they blew the whistle.
Yeah. One of the best tools of an investigator is to go into the courthouse and see who hates you, who has sued you before. We call that sniffing out the vintage where the sour grapes are stored.
Right.
And no one knows you more than someone that hates you. If someone likes you, they'll tell 3 people. If they hate you, they'll tell 100. So, you know, these are the people that are the ones that give the information, that make these big investigations.
You told me a little story during the break about a Ponzi scheme. Can you elaborate on that? That's an interesting story as well.
Well, Ponzi was an Italian immigrant that did multi-million-dollar frauds in New York and in New England years ago, but his scheme was to take your money and give it back to you in pieces so you think you're making interest.
Give you back your own money.
Your own money. And today we have a scheme that's just been uncovered in Houston of a woman that took in at least $30 million from investors, people that thought they were getting 10% a month interest. And what they were just getting is part of their own money, and she kept on taking in new money, so more and more was there.
$30 million. You would think at some point she'd have enough. When
Well, it's hard to say. The more you have, the more you want. And I understand that she had a collection of hundreds and hundreds of these Judith Leder purses, which are thousands of dollars each. And in shopping, she made Imelda Marcus look like a piker.
Do you think it's just greed? Is that what fuels this need to keep stealing?
It's greed, excitement, and the habit of doing it, Sam.
It's the habit of doing it.
Very, very wealthy people often go on committing petty fraud, not because it's going to give them more money in their pocket, but because it's fun to get away with it. And there's a certain excitement of living on the edge. You can either jump off cliffs and go adventure skiing or scuba diving, or you can get money any way you can. I mean, there's a certain thrill associated with being a success at being fraudulent, I
Success
suppose.
at being a fraud. Right.
And I think this operates in a lot of cases. What about you, Ed?
Exactly, that these people get an adrenaline high, a rush. It's their way of winning. It's their way of keeping score. And as my good friend Joe Wells once said, there's no such thing as a small fraud. There's only a big fraud that hasn't grown up yet.
What is white-collar crime? What do you think of as white-collar crime? What's the definition?
Sam, let me put it in perspective. 40 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of white-collar crime because the regulation of what white-collar people did was not very advanced. Mm-hmm. The incredible growth in regulation has led to a dramatic increase in illegal activities. The person who now drops oil out the back door of his factory onto the ground is a criminal. because it's an environmental crime.
Is that white-collar crime?
If the guy does it, absolutely. If the guy responsible for doing it, who gives the orders, wears a white collar, it's called white-collar crime.
And what about the bank teller who steals the $5,000? Is she a white-collar criminal, you think?
No, that's just straight embezzlement.
Straight
Yeah,
embezzlement.
The white-collar crime would be the executive that did it. But I have to disagree a little bit. I think the increase in white-collar crime is because of the increase in the money supply and the ease in which people can put their hands on millions and millions of dollars.
And you think that's just because of high technology existing today?
Not just high tech, but the increase in money supply means there's just an incredible amount of money circulating around. Look, there was a famous author who said that there's a magic moment in time when the money is in midair. At a closing, in every transaction, the money's in midair. That's when the accountants and the lawyers, the appraisers and the brokers all take their slice out.
That's a terrific term. I've never heard that before.
The result of the increase in technology and being able to wire transfer billions of dollars instantaneously around the world means that there's more money in midair longer, and therefore more people can get at it. Not just the legitimate servicers of accountants, lawyers, CPAs, and brokers, but also that guy who can manipulate a computer and divert a little bit of that stream into his pocket instead of where it should go.
A computer, I read about these two fellas who put a money machine in the middle of a mall. And people kept using the money machine. They put their money card in, plugged in their personal identification number. Machine went blank. They couldn't get any money out. It said, sorry, out of order. They took their card back and they left. 2 months later, the machine was removed. And evidently, these white-collar criminals replaced or redid all of the individuals' cards, took them to their own money machines, put them in the machines, plugged in the individual's personal identification number, which they were able to extract from the time that the real individuals put their money in, and were able to steal hundreds and thousands of dollars. They got caught because the camera was there on the money machine taking pictures of their faces. Do people get caught because they're dumb?
Many do. Some of them really just do it until they do get caught. Eddie Antar is a good example. He knew what he was doing. He knew that it was getting worse and worse, but it seemed so easy, and he felt so good about outsmarting all these high-priced people that he just kept on doing it.
It's a crazy Eddie story.
Yeah.
Right? He was just insane.
Literally.
What, do you think that people are anxious to outwit their employers or their stockholders or their banks or their insurance company? Is it a game? Has it become exciting? What do you think?
To some people it is, sure.
Yeah.
I think the great majority of the American people are not. And I remain confident and hopeful that we're not going to be a nation taken over by criminals and white-collar criminals and people stealing. I just don't think, because if we are, we're dead and through, and our country's not going to amount to a damn. But
we have about 20 seconds left. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Ed?
Well, the one thing I guess I would say is that today's barbarian, the one that used to be with the loincloth and the club, today wears a Brooks Brothers suit and a gold Rolex. Yeah. They are the people that commit the crimes. And I have to agree with Al that the majority of people are honest, they are hardworking, they try to make things work, but there's still more people out there all the time, and they're getting younger all the time that do commit white-collar crime.
Al, 10 seconds. What do you have to end with for tonight's program?
I wish it were otherwise, Sam, but I'm afraid that crime and white-collar crime is going to be with us, and the more we put money in midair and make it easier to make that great circle around the world instantaneously, the more people are going to get at it.
And as long as people lie, cheat, and steal, we all have a job.
Well, Ed, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Al, thanks for joining me on White Collar Crime Report. Tonight, this is Sam Rosenthal, White Collar Crime Report, and watch it, or the greed will get you too. I'm Sam Rosenfarb. Welcome to the White Collar Crime Report. Tonight on our show, we'll explore different scams used by white-collar criminals. To discuss this topic, we have with us criminal attorney Raymond M. Brown from Brown & Brown Attorneys in Newark, New Jersey, and Lloyd D. Levinson, criminal attorney from Cooper, Persky & Levinson, one of the largest law firms in Atlantic City. Lloyd, tell us, coming from Atlantic City, you must have some casino stories for us. Tell us a little bit about your firm and your practice.
Well, Sam, I've been down in Atlantic City now for about 12 years, and I pinch myself every day when I get up because it is the most fascinating way to practice law. I represent various casinos, I represent the employees, I represent vendors doing business with casinos, and I mix that with some criminal defense work, mostly on the white-collar variety. And as often happens, the two sometimes get mixed up together because often the employees, of which we have tens of thousands in the casino industry, get in trouble. The regulators want to get them out of the industry, and so I come in and deal with their defense on the criminal side, then also try to keep their licenses on the administrative side. So it's a very interesting practice.
Well, thanks, Lloyd. Ray, the name Brown & Brown is extremely well known in the criminal defense field. Tell us a little bit about your firm and your work, especially your work on court TV. Very interested in that.
I practice in Newark with my dad. We have a practice that's statewide. We do all kinds of trial work, a large percentage of it criminal and a good chunk of that what you would call white-collar work. For the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of commentary on court television. I did a fair amount of work with respect to the Rodney King case, and just whenever they call, if I'm available, we go over and talk about cases.
You were involved in the first licensing of one of the casinos in Atlantic City Resorts, weren't you? Tell us about that.
That's true. The first casino in New Jersey to apply for a license was Resorts International. And New Jersey, which wanted to distinguish itself from Las Vegas and show that it was clean and pristine and pure, challenged Resorts, alleging that they had employed employees who were organized crime personnel, that they'd paid off the Bahamian government where they had a license. They raised the issue of, remember Baby Rebozo and the Nixon?
Oh, sure.
Well, the money was supposed to have been passed to Rebozo underneath the bridge that goes to Paradise Island where Resorts had its casino. So there was a...
And Resorts was implicated in that.
Well, there was they claimed that the cash was raised at Resorts Casino with Resorts connivance or Resorts being willing to let it happen. And all of those issues were raised in a 65-page report that we had to challenge effectively in order to get them their license.
Obviously, you were successful.
We were successful.
They got their first license.
That's true.
What kind of scams or schemes go on in casinos? You know, there is a lot of money, obviously, going through the coffers of the casinos. Tell us a little bit about some of them.
Well, Sam, only the imagination limits the number of scams that go on in casinos. Over the last month, if you just pick up the paper in Atlantic City, you could see, for example, a particular scam where dealers and floor persons and pit bosses got together and developed a system whereby they rated gamblers, because everybody that goes in and is a high roller, you know, it gets rated, and you keep a record. The casino keeps a record of how well they do and how much money they win or lose.
And what's the consequence of that rating system?
Well, the consequence, the legitimate consequence, is you determine as a casino the amount of complimentaries that a gambler gets, all right? So one of the scams was the dealers and the bosses got together in one of the casinos, and they set forth on the ratings cards that the individual gamblers had won a lot more than they actually won, and they walked with the chips. They really didn't walk with the chips, but they developed the ratings cards to that effect. And what happened was...
And the consequence was they got additional complimentary?
No, not on that one. There's another case like that. The consequence was that the dealers, the floor persons, and the pit bosses walked away with the chips. In other words,
they walked away with the chips ostensibly won by these players.
Exactly. To the tune of, you ready? $500,000.
Wow.
And they were just convicted just recently. In fact, the floor person just was sentenced to 7 years in jail. The others got lighter sentences because the cases were weaker against them, but very, very prominent scam.
Typically, is collusion required for some of these scams, right? You know, do you need more than one person?
Well, there's frequently an allegation of collusion. Certainly, where there is, for example, we had discussed at the break or earlier that we were involved in the case that the Bronx brought against the then sitting Secretary of Labor, Raymond Donovan.
Right.
And the allegation was that Donovan's company had set up a phony minority business in order to steal $63 million from the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York. And the allegation was further that at least certain government officials had turned a blind eye to the fact this ostensibly black company wasn't really black and was run by Italians.
And did he get this job ostensibly because he was a black-owned company? Is that why he was able to generate these fees?
The allegation was that the Schiavone Construction Company, which did the bulk of the work with huge tunnel boring machines, was required to give 10% of the business to minority companies. And the claim was that the companies that were ostensibly minority really weren't. It just so happened that while the job was underway, a guy named Billy Maselli, who was a guy who sold basically meat out of a butcher shop, but also batteries and anything else he could get his hands on, was one of the people who had an interest in one of the minority companies. And since his name was Maselli and he was Italian, there was an allegation that there was a fraud, and there happened to be a 6-month wiretap going on in his butcher shop at the time.
Just coincidentally.
Just coincidentally. But based on that, there was an investigation. First, it started in Washington. The FBI investigated, found no criminality. Then there were 2 grand juries which found no criminality, federal grand juries, and then the Bronx DA's office stepped in. And while you may find this surprising, Mario Marola, who is a Democrat in the Bronx, thought he would like to be the first person ever to indict a sitting cabinet officer. So he indicts Donovan and the executives of his company and the company, and there was then a 9-month trial, which led to the acquittal of the individual defendants.
And you were representing Donovan at the time?
I represented the principal minority business enterprise officer of the Schiavone Construction Company.
Yeah.
And that case is interesting for Donovan's statement afterwards about where does he go to get his reputation back, because once you're sullied with an indictment like that, it's difficult to ever recover your good name.
Sure, he was acquitted, but yet he went through all of this.
Well, he'll always be known as the only cabinet officer ever indicted while in office.
Well, you were a former prosecutor. How's being on the defense side different? Is there a difference?
There's a big difference. There's a big difference, and my friends that are still prosecutors may disagree with this, but it's much tougher being on the defense side than being in the prosecution. As a prosecutor, you have unlimited assistance. I mean, you have detectives and investigators and younger assistants and people to go run out and do everything. As a private defense counsel, you may have some assistance. You could hire an investigator and you do different things of that sort, but you don't have the resources that you have. Another thing that's very important is you don't have the pressure on you as a prosecutor that you have as a defense attorney. When you have that family come in, and normally my practice is first offenders who do something wrong, and allegedly, the mother and father comes in, and how could my son or daughter have ever done this?
But on the first side, being a prosecutor, you're getting the bad guys. And now as a defense attorney, you're assisting the bad guys.
Well, you make an assumption which affects this balance that Lloyd was talking about, because most folks assume that if you're indicted, you must be guilty. It's an erroneous assumption. It's an unfair assumption.
It's the Donovan case all over again.
And that assumption makes it hard for any defendant to get a fair trial, and it's an assumption that isn't valid. The defense lawyer's job is to make sure that everybody gets a fair trial and to acquit those that the government cannot convict.
But getting a conviction doesn't necessarily mean that the individuals are not, assuming they get an acquittal, doesn't necessarily mean that the individuals aren't guilty. No. Getting an acquittal just necessarily means they couldn't prove that they were guilty.
That's correct.
What's the distinction?
Well, the alternative is to have the sovereign or the prosecutor or the governor just point to people and say you're guilty. There has to be some process, and the process has to say if the government can't prove it, you have to walk free. And that's something we all agree to in theory, but when we sit on a jury or when we talk to our friends, for example, I suspect Lloyd will agree with this, if I ride on a plane or a bus or a train, the most commonly asked question, or occasionally if I'm invited to a cocktail party, somebody will come up to me and say, how can you represent those people? The assumption being that these are some seamy folks who should not be represented, and that somehow there's something sleazy about being connected to that process.
Well, I'll tell you, the question I get asked most is, what do I do when the defendant comes in to hire me, or during the course? I think Sam asked me this recently. What do I do when the client says, I did it? And then you have to continue on with the defense. And it's a very...
What do you do?
Well,
the first point is that you don't care whether your client is guilty or innocent, except from a tactical point of view. Your job is to force the government or the state to prove its case or to have the person acquitted.
So it's irrelevant whether he's guilty or innocent.
It's totally irrelevant to me.
yeah. The problem is the real problem occurs if he tells you that he is particularly guilty, and we have an obligation as attorneys not to put him on the witness stand and knowingly permit him to commit perjury and say something different than he has told us.
Is it different for white-collar criminals versus violent criminals? Is the strategy the same?
I tend to find that white-collar criminals are more sanctimonious and self-righteous. That is, they don't even want to admit that they've been indicted. Whereas people who are just street criminals say, I got a problem, help me out with the problem. So you frequently have to cut through more layers of status and respectability and what will the neighbors think with white-collar criminals.
Well, certainly some of the loss of reputation, or in Donovan's case, merely the indictment and going through the trial, caused them a loss of reputation. That in itself is some form of punishment.
Yeah.
I sense that people think white-collar criminals don't get the same kind of sentencing. Their sentencing is lighter. They get off more often. They could afford higher-priced attorneys like the two of you. What do you think of that?
Everything you've just said is completely accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's accurate. Sure. I think it's accurate that the people that have more money can hire normally the better lawyers, and the lawyers that can spend more time on their particular case and prepare it better than others. Also think that the white-collar criminal is given a lesser sentence proportionally than the violent criminal. I'll give you an example. You have to steal over 75, as a first offender, you have to steal $75,000 or more to be in a certain area where you will be going to prison. So you steal in this state $74,999 and you don't have a prior record, there's a presumption that you shouldn't go to jail. Now, that's a lot of money. Now,
that is an awful lot of money.
A lot of people are going to be running out, Lloyd, stealing $74,000 now that you've said that.
I think that's the name of the program, how to commit fraud and get away with it.
Well, Lloyd is right insofar as he says that economics determines your fate. And certainly if you can hire better counsel, you're going to get better results. But it's also true that there's a certain myth that we vigorously prosecute white-collar crime. If you go back to the resource question, the Congress, for example, has been debating for 3 years a crime bill. That crime package has all kinds of enhanced and serious penalties for street crime, very little toughening of white-collar criminals.
And is that because
the SNL scandal, a relatively small percentage of the potential defendants were ever indicted in connection with the $500 billion that were stolen from SNLs in this country, in large measure because we're not committed to prosecuting white-collar crime to the same extent that we are street crime.
Do you think the teller who steals $5,000, she gets 3 years in jail, whereas the bank president who steals $5 million, he may never go to jail?
I think that's a myth. That in this state, the bank teller that steals $5,000 does not go to jail, Sam. Does not.
And the bank president who steals $5 million?
Well, he may go to jail, but depending upon how much money he has to pay back the $5 million. See, in this state, your ability to make restitution also, and that has to do with, how wealthy you are and maybe how you've squirreled away the money you've stolen. But the government is very interested in getting back the money that was stolen. So if you're able to pay it back, you are in effect buying time off your sentence.
One of the ironies, though, that has been pointed out about the federal sentencing system, which is very rigid and has fixed penalties for most crimes, is that the only way that you can get what's called a downward departure, that is, to allow the judge to sentence you much lower, is if you can cooperate. Now, and give up other people, but who can cooperate? The little person at the bottom.
I'd like to talk more about cooperation and the sentencing guidelines when we come back from this break. I'm Sam Rosenthal for the White Collar Crime Report. We'll be back in a few seconds. Welcome back to the White Collar Crime Report. This is Sam Rosenthal, and with me is Raymond M. Brown, criminal attorney from Brown & Brown, Newark, Lloyd D. Levinson, criminal attorney from Cooper, Persky & Levinson, one of the largest law firms in Atlantic City. Prior to the break, Ray, we were talking about sentencing guidelines and how you could get downward.
In the federal system, there's a rigid structure which provides for pretty fixed sentences for most offenses, as well as some crimes for which there's a mandatory minimum sentence.
Is that both white-collar crime and violent crime?
That's
both?
across the board. That's with respect to any violation. But what happens is that the only way you can get a downward departure of significant dimensions or relief from mandatory minimums is to have the government come in and represent to the judge that you've cooperated substantially. The implication of that is clear, that if you have a big organization, whether it's drugs or embezzlement, the people at the top usually know other people they can cooperate against. The people at the bottom don't have anything of value to give. And so in frequent situations, people lower in the structure of a criminal organization will wind up doing more time than the guys at the
So
top.
a
'Cause they
low-level
can't
criminal,
cooperate.
he can't get a downward departure.
That's true. And so that's an injustice that frequently runs against our intuitive sense of what's fair.
So that, and that may account for some of the perception that white-collar criminals go to jail less frequently, serve less time.
But also our resources as a society aren't devoted that way. Partly it's because policy decisions have been made that street crime is a greater threat. Partly it's because many people are frightened by irresponsible political leadership who doesn't want to deal with the issue.
Is it your sense that white-collar crime is a less threat to society than violent crime?
No question. You interview the man on the street or the man who refuses to go on the street because he's afraid to go on the street, and that's most of America, and they will tell you that it's violent crime that they are afraid of. White-collar crime, it exists. It may cost them money, shoplifting, and right up from shoplifting all up to big savings and loan scandals. To them, it's I think to the average Joe, that's the cost of living. But talk about violent crime and the ability to walk outside your house and not get clubbed over the head, that's what they're concerned with.
But there's a good argument the other way. And the good argument the other way has two components to it. The first involves the fact that if you take the 500 billion SNL scandal, that ate up the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. Tremendous consequences for everything from Head Start to other kinds of things that people need that government can give. The second involves, how do you define white-collar crime? If you look at the drugs that exist in the streets of America, you know it's not the average young black kid or the poor white kid or the Latino kid who are smuggling that stuff in. The people at the tops of those organizations aren't being prosecuted. So to the extent that they may be white-collar crime, one can argue that much of the white-collar crime that escapes detection, prosecution, and conviction is a far greater threat and a cause of the other problem.
Well, why do you think that these white-collar criminals, as you call them, who are importing these goods, we're not developing the resources?
Because there's been no effort to do it. The Bush administration had a plan, which it wrote out, which said that we're going to go after street-level crime, and that's essentially been the answer that's been followed by local and state and federal law enforcement agencies for the last 12 years, and the Clinton administration shows no sign of changing.
It's also easier, Sam.
Oh,
it's
sure.
easier for law enforcement to go after the user of the drugs, the guy in the street, the two guys that are passing the drugs back and forth, than it is to penetrate through the upper echelon.
Yeah,
5 blocks from this studio, I'm sure Lloyd and I could, just because we've read about these things, could go and find some guys who were doing drugs in the streets and arrange for them to be arrested. We would never do that, but you could do that. If you were going to seriously investigate a ring that's bringing significant amounts of heroin or cocaine into Newark, you'd have to spend time and money and energy to do it. So there's a significant cost that's involved with the commitment.
Michael Chertoff at the American Bar Association convention in New York recently, he said his #1 thrust as U.S. attorney in this area is to go after political corruption and fraud. Do you believe that? Do you think he'll devote the resources and manpower?
I think he will, absolutely. See, people have to understand that there's a United States Attorney's Office and there are county prosecutors in each one of the counties. The United States Attorney's Office has the luxury in this state and in many states to sort of allow and know that the county prosecutor's offices are doing an excellent job in violent crime and prosecuting violent crime, which leaves the United States Attorney's Office with all of its resources, with the FBI, the Postal Service, and all of those different agencies to do the prosecution and investigation of serious political corruption.
There's a perception that when these serious white-collar criminals do get incarcerated, they go away to country club prisons. They have golf courses, tennis courses, color TVs. I read recently Noriega's holed up in a hotel room, color TV, VCR, fax. What's your impression of that? You familiar
Well,
with
Noriega has a special legal status, so he's probably not a good example. There's an argument that he's a prisoner of war.
I see.
But with respect to, certainly the Bureau of Prisons classifies inmates based in part on the extent to which they're a threat to security or to others, and to that extent, white-collar criminals frequently go to minimum security facilities. But that's not purely in terms of whether you're white-collar. It has to do with age, the nature of the offense, whether it's violent. So there are a number of factors that go into that. Some of these are stereotypes that people want to believe because, again, I think political leadership is generally pretty irresponsible in terms of talking to people in intelligent ways about what are frequently complex problems.
Do you think it's the nature of the problem that causes the lack of resources to be, the lack of resources to be accumulated to go after these white-collar criminals?
No, it's a decision that's made by the Congress or by the Justice Department or by the legislature about which crimes to prosecute. And clearly there have been policy decisions made, some of them sound, some of them absolutely absurd, to devote resources to street crimes as opposed to white-collar
What was
crimes.
one of your most interesting cases? You've had an illustrious career as a criminal attorney.
Well, I've had a number of interesting cases. I guess there was a case recently of a woman who was accused of having run over her husband in an automobile. And for some reason, that case got more attention than the Donovan case, which involved $63 million allegedly stolen.
What
from
was
her
the
coffers.
purpose of her running over her? Did she want to kill him?
That was the claim. She was exonerated of the charges. But it's interesting that people focus, when we picked the Donovan jury, we took about 2 months. And maybe 80% of the jurors who came through the courthouse said they'd never heard about the case, didn't know who Donovan was. A fair percentage said they didn't even know who the president was. But on the other hand, when we picked the jury in the other case, everybody in this county seemed to have heard about the case, knew exactly what kind of car she drove, and knew many details about the case. But we've represented public officials charged with a wide variety of crimes, and every case is important regardless of the status of the defendant.
Why is political corruption so widespread? Do you think it's endemic to the...
Why do you look
Answer
at me?
that question, Lloyd. Tell him why political corruption is so
Coming
widespread.
from Atlantic City, why
And
are
how
you
do you
asking
know?
me that question?
Well, wasn't it the last of the last 12 or 13 mayors who've been
Well,
in...
we lost track. The present mayor, though...
We represented Mayor Usry, so you should be careful.
Well, he was the last in a chain of mayors going back to Mike Matthews before him and others before him. I think we've turned the corner. I know we've turned the corner. Our present mayor is a solid citizen. Hear me, Mayor? And we have a checkered past in Atlantic City, but it's so easy, and especially when you're talking about small town America, which Atlantic City really is. I mean, even today, the government and the people, it's small town America. All this money coming in there, all this temptation. And what it did is it tempted...
Greed? Is it just greed?
But
Are politicians
Sam,
more
you sound
greedy?
like the little boy in the story about the emperor had no clothes. I mean, corruption is an endemic part of probably every political system, and certainly a part of this one. And especially as aid to cities dries up and people fight more and more over fewer and fewer dollars, corruption is probably going to increase. Whether it's all prosecuted is another story.
I mean, you take a situation where a mayor of a city that's got casinos is making only a limited amount of money compared to the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that casino executives make and other individuals doing business with a casino. The temptation is there to say, wait a minute, I'm the one who's really running this town, and I'm making barely enough to feed my family or send my kids to school, and all these people are making money and they want something from me, so why can't I take a little bit?
What was Usry convicted of? What was
Well, actually, he was not convicted. There was an admission of him into the PTI program. So he wasn't convicted of any crime.
What is the PTI
The allegation.
program?
It's an intervention, a diversionary program designed to take people before they've had to go to trial and move them into another program.
Did he
so
have to
that-
admit guilt? in
No,
order
he
to
did
do
not. In fact, the allegation was that he had taken some cash in connection with some concessions in Atlantic City on the boardwalk.
So is it because politicians control huge sums of money that
They
their
control the
greed-
decisions that are affecting huge sums of money. You know, everything from the
So what's the
question.
solution? What do we do to politicians? How do we change the system so that political corruption doesn't affect our lives forever? Herb Stern began this white-collar crime prosecution 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and we're seeing it today with Michael Chertoff. When will it end?
It'll never end.
Never end. Greed is with us forever.
Probably. Look, the question about government involves controlling resources and deciding who gets what and when. In fact, that's a classical definition of politics. As long as those decisions are made, there'll be people who want to get a piece of that pie who will attempt to do what they can improperly to get a piece. What you have to do is make sure that you always have independent prosecutors who can go after it. I mean, one of the reasons that the federal prosecutors are more effective is that in this state, the county prosecutor is usually tied to the local machine, and he's not going to be vigorous in prosecuting corruption there. That's why U.S. attorneys have generally had a better track record. But it's also true that recently a judge in Atlanta said that the Justice Department turned a blind eye to a tremendous scandal in connection with Irangate and the Bush administration's involvement in criminal activity. So power tends to choke off investigations.
Ray, recently you were a panelist in Atlantic City on the topic defense and prosecution of white-collar crime and public servant crimes. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the seminar involved a seminar that's put on every year by a lawyer organization having to involve training young lawyers. And we were talking about the fact that there are special problems involved with representing public officials. The first is they don't want to listen to you. They're used to running their own show, and so taking advice is real tough for them. The second is the first thing you tell any defendant beginning when he first walks in the door is keep your mouth shut. If he's a public official, what he'll do is listen to you, walk out the door, and hold a press conference. So those kinds of controls are very difficult and maybe the biggest challenge in representing public officials.
Lloyd, we have about 30 seconds left. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your membership on the board of directors of International Association of Gaming Attorneys. I find that fascinating. International Association.
It used to be the National Association of Gaming Attorneys, but with the proliferation of gaming across the world, the organization changed about 5 years ago, and there are 18 of us who are on the board of directors. And as we discussed earlier, the number of countries that now have legalized gaming would stagger you. We have gaming in South Africa and Yugoslavia and Malaysia, in addition to maybe gaming coming to the riverboats in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and they're even talking about our nation's capital having legalized gaming coming very soon. So we are an organization that is very interested in making sure that casinos are regulated around the world appropriately so that no black eye is given to the industry. Thank you very much, Lloyd. Ray, thank you very much for joining me tonight. This is Sam Rosenfarb for the White Collar Crime Report. Join me next time, and watch it before the greed gets you too. Thank you.